Alright, guys, we got a pretty interesting interview to talk about here today. Which, this was from this past weekend, I believe, but I'm just now getting around to talking about it. But at Tokyo Game Show, we did get an interview with the creator of the Dragon Quest series, Yuji Horii, as well as the former editor-in-chief for Shonen Jump, Kazuhiko Torishima, and they were talking about the upcoming Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake that is coming out here soon. And during this interview, they did bring up the topic of censorship, which unfortunately is going to be affecting that game. And it sort of led them into talking about, sort of censorship on games at large, and some of the sort of, let's call it modern day Californian shit. Shout out to Az from Heel vs. Babyface. But, some of the modern day shit that's been affecting gaming. And they made some pretty interesting comments during this. Some pretty accurate comments, I think, for the most part as well. But I did find this pretty interesting, so I did want to talk about this interview here today. Now, full disclosure here up front, I actually never have played any of the Dragon Quest games. It's one of those series that I've always wanted to play, but I've just never actually gotten around to doing it. It's not really relevant to what I want to talk about here today, since this is largely focused on the upcoming HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest III, and the censorship that is going to be in that game, which that part's not news. We've known about that for a little bit now. But if you didn't hear, it is confirmed that some of the artwork in that game is going to be censored, specifically with the female warrior in that game, I believe. She is having her outfit changed to cover up some exposed skin, which is something we've seen quite a bit of, in recent years across various games. Which I actually was kind of bummed when we got that news, since, for one thing, I just absolutely love these HD 2D games. I think that whole art style is just absolutely gorgeous. The Octopath Traveler series, Triangle Strategy, we've gotten several of these now. And when they announced that we were getting some HD 2D versions of the older Dragon Quest games, that was something that I was extremely interested in. They're doing 3 first, but they've also confirmed that they're going to do Dragon Quest 1 and 2 as well. But after we got news of that censorship, it kind of just soured me on the entire thing. I'm so tired of dealing with issues like this that it just kind of just killed my whole hype. I don't know if I'm even going to bother fooling with this game now. I'm really undecided. But beyond that, the other thing that also really bothered me was the fact that they were doing this to a remake, which is a common thing. We've seen that a lot. A lot of old remakes or remasters or ports or whatever have had a lot of changes. This isn't even the first example of this we've seen from Square Enix. We had the whole Tifa's outfit debacle with Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's not a thing exclusive to Square Enix either. It's, across the board. Hell, even something as innocuous as the Pikmin 1 and 2 compilation on Switch changed a lot of the item descriptions and stuff to comply with modern audiences. So, this is a very common problem, but it's something that bothers me more when they do it with remakes or ports of older games, more so than doing it on just a new game. Which, it's bad enough on a new game when they put in any kind of this bullshit. But when they do it to an older game, the reason we're usually getting any of those ports or remasters or remakes or whatever it may be is because the older version of the game isn't really easily accessible. And if you end up disagreeing with the changes that they make, there's usually not a simple way to get access to the original version of the game. If you would rather play that, you might have to have some really old hardware, or you might have to track down an old physical copy, which could end up being very, very expensive. Or, of course, you could resort to having to use emulators or sailing the seven seas, which has its own set of hoops to jump through and problems to face with that as well. So it's just really annoying to me that they're going through the trouble of making these older games more readily available, but they're butchering them in the process and alienating the people that would have been interested in them in the first place. So it bothers me more when it affects older games like this. About the only thing that's more egregious that I can think of is another thing we've had a few cases of recently, where they actually patch a really old game and add the censorship directly to it. That happened with Skullgirls, and I think a few other times as well with some other games. But that's definitely the most egregious, screwing over people that have purchased and played your game for potentially years at that point, and just going back and changing content that's been around for that long. That's definitely beyond the pale, but I wouldn't put censorship like this that much far behind it. So cases like this do really bother me. And another compounding factor with this entire thing is that, of course, the art for the Dragon Quest games was made by Akira Toriyama, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. So, of course, some of his work being censored and changed so closely after his death is definitely something that's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Understandably so. So, the censorship for this game is a bunch of nonsense, which is pretty much always the case with any censorship for any game. But they did talk about that in this interview, getting back on topic here, which I do have this interview in front of me since I do want to read some direct quotes from it. I will have a link in the description to a Niche Gamer article that has a full translation of this interview if you want to read through it for yourself. But during this, the topic of censorship did come up, and Yuji Horii did make some comments here talking about the changes to the costumes, as well as to some other changes to this game and a lot of modern games. Specifically, the whole body type 1 and 2 thing, replacing male and female, which is another thing we've had quite a few cases of lately. Even in a few games that have otherwise been very well received, even things like Elden Ring or what have you, have done this. But Horii did talk about this, and he largely just expressed confusion about why any of this is even a thing to begin with, which I can definitely understand where he's coming from there. But when he was talking about the whole body type thing, he did say, quote, "We have to call them Type 1 and Type 2. I truly wonder who is even complaining about this." Well, if I can, allow me to explain it to you, Mr. Horii. No one is actually complaining about this, because for the most part, this entire thing is largely a crock of horseshit. For the most part, there isn't anyone who's actually offended by a character creator in a game saying male or female instead of body type 1 or 2. This is a thing that's being pushed by a very small number of insane people who have weaseled their way into positions of influence, and then it's being propped up and supported by leftists at large, since largely it's because people that they don't like this, so they have to defend it. It aggravates people that they perceive as their enemies, so they're going to support these decisions and be very vocal about it. Even though in their heart of hearts they don't actually care about these changes. They don't actually care about the games at all, in some cases. But it pisses off people that they don't like. So they're going to use that opportunity to annoy their perceived enemies, and also sit up on their high horse and talk down to everyone about how morally superior they are. So that's one of the things that people really need to understand about this whole thing and about wokeness in general, is that none of this is actually real. It's all a bunch of pretense and bullshit meant to prop up the superiority complexes of a bunch of nut jobs. So a lot of the other comments in this interview I did want to talk about actually came from Torishima. I thought he actually made some really good points here. And in one part he was talking about, his work in Shonen Jump and when they were bringing those books over to America and what they had to go through to release them over here, and, changes that had to be made or what have you. and how it was sometimes difficult to comply with, the various rules or regulations that we have over here, and, having to jump through all those hoops. So one of the quotes he had was, quote, "Compliance is like an all-powerful God. It's something that is using the name of good but is actually bad. It's impossible every single person doesn't feel uncomfortable. It's fine to feel uncomfortable. Beautiful and ugly, good and evil. It depends on the person." So I think a lot of what he said there is very accurate, but the part that really jumped out to me was when he mentioned that it was using the name of good but is actually bad, which I think that's really just hitting the nail on the head with his entire, modern audience, wokeness, whatever term you want to use for it. This entire thing can really be summed up with, evil masquerading as good. Because what have we been dealing with for all these years? They dress it up with all this nice sounding language about inclusivity and tolerance and diversity and all this stuff that sounds real fluffy and cuddly and nice. But it's actually not about any of that. It's about censorship, and it's about controlling things, and it's about splitting people apart into groups so you can play them against one another. It's about identity politics. It's about influencing culture so you can pursue political goals. The entire thing's a crock of horseshit, but it's dressed up in this veil of nice-sounding, smiley-face, happy terminology. And it's really fooled a lot of people into going along with this. Now, I think recently a lot of people are very slowly starting to realize that it is a crock of shit, and it actually isn't benefiting anyone. But it's taken a long time for some people to kind of get the memo on that one. So that one particular comment from Torishima there really resonated with me and really stood out, because evil disguised as good is probably the simplest explanation of wokeness that I could possibly imagine. Now, if there was one point of contention I would have with this entire thing, it is this next quote also from Torishima, which I think he's actually off on this. But he did say, quote, "In Western countries, there's a root of thinking based on religion, and it influences their sex education, right? Their attitude to compliance is really narrow-minded." Now, I could be misinterpreting this a little bit, or maybe something here was lost in translation, or what have you, but the way I read this is it sounds like Torishima is under the impression that all these censorship demands and all these things that they have to comply with is stemming from some sorts of, religious puritanism or something. And frankly, that's just not the case. Let's be honest here, all this censorship push is absolutely coming from leftists. It's coming from, Californian wokals for the most part. It's definitely not some pearl-clutching Bible thumper, complaining about little Timmy being tempted by Satan because, your video game character showed too much skin. That's just not the case right now. Maybe that was the case sometimes in the past. Maybe that could potentially be the case at some point in the future if, the pendulum swings too far the other way. But as of right now, that's absolutely not what's happening here. Even if those people would want to do something like that, they're not in any sort of position of power to be able to do so right now, since all the positions of influence are occupied by, woke nut jobs, again, largely from the West Coast. So I felt like that might be a little bit of a misconception he has there about the root cause of all this, though I do think he is correct in his larger point. So there is one last quote from this interview I do want to talk about here. It's another one from Torishima, which, when I read it at first, I just thought it was funny, but the more I thought about it, it actually is speaking to a much larger issue that I think is really important. So we got one last quote from him where he was talking about, again, doing business in the West. And he said, quote, "Doing business with a ridiculous country like this is such a hassle. Coming from this, Japan gets negatively influenced as well." So when I first read this, it did make me laugh since he called America a ridiculous country, which I'd like to argue with him, but honestly, right now we are pretty ridiculous, and I don't think I could make that argument in good faith. So he's not totally wrong, but the more I thought about it, the part that really stuck with me where he was talking about Japan being negatively influenced by this. And my takeaway from this is that a bunch of leftist nut jobs have made the entire world think that we're a bunch of retards. And now this is influencing their decision making when it comes to bringing their media over here or doing business in this country or whatever the case may be. And I actually think it's very important that we sort of get the message across to the people in Japan or any other country, really, that would be in positions that, they're in charge of some sort of big media group. They're in charge of bringing over whatever content, whether it be video games, whether it be manga, whether it be anime, anything. I think it's important that we make these people understand that the perception of America or the perception of the West that they might get from mainstream media or mainstream culture or even just viewing the West through the lens of social media, that this perception of how the West is or our views on things or how we feel about certain topics or what have you, I think they need to understand that this perception is largely inaccurate and doesn't really represent the average person over here or the average consumer for any of their media, the average audience for anything that they might be bringing over. I think it's important that we get them to understand that we don't want Japanese media censored or changed for, any sort of sensibilities or whatever. We want our Japanese media to be in its original intended form. We want it to be as Japanese as possible, for lack of a better term. If we were offended by it or if we were bothered by it, we wouldn't be seeking it out in the first place. We would just stick to consuming Western media. And people are turning against Western media in droves because Western media largely sucks dick right now. In more ways than one, in some cases. But we're specifically going to Japanese media or Eastern media or Korean, whatever. We're specifically going to some sort of foreign media because we don't like what we're being fed over here. And the last thing we want is for the things that we're seeking out to morph into the thing that we're trying to get away from in the first place. So getting that message across to Japanese creators or whoever would be in charge of making these sorts of decisions, I think is something that's really, really important right now, especially in protecting one of the last few bastions we have of good entertainment, outside of elements of the independent scene right now. So that's one of the things that really came to mind to me when I read that quote in that interview, was that, this false perception of how America is or how the West is could definitely lead to some poor choices being made. And I think that's a really bad thing. So if I could tell them anything and help them understand, I know no one, of importance is ever going to see this video. But if I could get one message across to them, it would be that they really need to understand that California and the West are definitely not the same thing. And that censoring or localizing or whatever you want to call this, doing this to your content to bring it over here is not going to increase the reach of your audience. It's not going to grow the size of your fan base. If anything, it's just going to alienate the very people who are going to be interested in your stuff to begin with. But anyhow, I guess that's all I got to say, so lots of luck to you and yours.